Welcome. I'm Laura Smits, President of the League of Women Voters of Connecticut, and I welcome you today to our ranked choice voting information session. We're going to start today. We're going to have a bunch of things going on, so it's a great time to pay attention to voting rights and ways we can expand voter choice, which is what our topic is today, ranked choice voting. I'm going to put a couple of housekeeping messages in for you. If you have time, we ask that you put your town and member, if you're a member, in the chat. That would be helpful, your local league's name if you have one. And I'm also going to announce for the voter service chair, Liz Donovan, I want you to save the date for a Zoom on January 25th at 7 p.m. Details to follow for all public, state, and local league events. Check the website calendar at www.lwvct.org. And we'll have that dropped in the chat for you as well. And now Tisha Rossi, our advocacy vice president, has a few words for us. Go Tish.
Thank you. Thank you, Laura. I'm here just to continue what Laura was saying about things to be aware of and to look for. In January, we will have our advocacy workshop. In the end of the month, we haven't set a date yet, and it will be by Zoom, which is consistent with the way, unfortunately or fortunately, the legislature is going to be conducted in 2022. It will likely be not in person. So please look for that, and please come to the workshop so we can talk about how we're going to get our work pushed forward in 2022. For those of you who are watching the federal scene, which I hope we all are, the National League of Women Voters had a field call last night in which they encouraged us to not let our senators let the Build Back Better, a debt ceiling, military spending bills push the voting rights bills out of center stage where they belong. If we don't pass these bills in 2021, they will not affect the 2022 elections or any redistricting that's yet to be done. So it's very important they be passed before the end of this year, and we're to encourage the Senate not to go into recess as planned on Monday, the 13th, through January 6th, but to stay in session to pass these bills. Let's see, and if we aren't able to get them to delay the recess, we are encouraged to get in touch with our senators during the recess while they are home to make sure that they are going to keep these voting rights bills front and center. Please look, as Laura's encouraged you to, for our news you can use, and on our website for events that we will be conducting in January to support voting rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Tisha. Okay, if you'd like to join the league, visit our website or email us at lwvct@lwvct.org. That should also be dropped in the chat. This session will be recorded and available on our LWVCT YouTube channel. And we're going to drop that link into the chat as well for you. We'll have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. You can use the Q&A function to submit your question or raise your hand if you want to speak, and we will promote you to panelists. Our speaker today is Jonathan Perloe. Jonathan is a good friend of our league. He's worked with us a lot last year during COVID to help spread information about absentee ballots and all of that kind of thing that we had to do because of the situation. He is a very, very organized ally, and we are very glad to have him with us. He's an election reform and gun violence prevention activist who lives in Greenwich. He helps lead Voter Choice Connecticut, the volunteer citizens group working to bring ranked choice voting to Connecticut following the 2016 election. He co-led the successful grassroots effort to get Connecticut to join the National Popular Vote Compact. Jonathan is a member of the League of Greenwich, yay, and has planned several educational forums on voting and election reform with both the Greenwich and Westport Leagues. For his day job, Jonathan is Director of Communications for Connecticut Against Gun Violence. Jonathan joined CAGV in 2017 after serving on its board since 2014. Like many in Connecticut, he got involved in gun violence prevention following the Sandy Hook school shooting. His entry into legislative advocacy followed more than 30 years of marketing communication strategy on both the client and agency side. I give you Jonathan Perloe.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that very nice introduction. And thanks also just to the League of Women Voters of Connecticut for offering us this opportunity to talk about ranked choice voting. Little known fact, or something that I feel is notable, is it was actually after the Sandy Hook shooting when the Greenwich League of Women Voters organized or chartered a bus to go up to the March for Change rally at the Capitol on Valentine's Day in 2013, which was the first time I realized that the League actually did advocacy as well as voter education. And my presence at that event, that rally, I have to say, was sort of a defining moment for me in getting involved in activism. So a lot of credit goes to the League for doing that. So I am going to share my screen. I'll go through the presentation, try to do that as quickly as possible so that we have time for questions. And I would love to have questions about ranked choice voting itself, but also any questions or thoughts about how the League can further our efforts in terms of getting what I will talk about on the ranked choice voting study bill passed in the next legislative session. We'd love to work with the local leagues on that. So let me share my screen. Okay. So we do believe that ranked choice voting is a must-have election reform, and hopefully by the end of the session that you will agree as well, or at least agree that it's something we should be really looking into, which is actually the first step in our plan. I just finished reading this great book by Lawrence Lessig about how to improve or fix our representative democracy to make it more representative. And the whole kind of underlying thesis of what we need to do to secure democracy is how do we make it more representative? And that is at its essence what ranked choice voting is about. When we think about election reform and voting rights, we've kind of come up with this construct of 4 key pillars. One is how can we make it easier for people to vote, for people who are allowed to vote. How can we expand the electorate? So how can we make it possible for more people to have the voter franchise? And then third, how do we ensure election integrity? And despite a lot of misinformation about voter fraud and things like that, it is very important that people feel that their elections are secure and that their vote is going to count or be counted. And then the last one is about representative outcomes. And so not only do we need to make it easy for more people to vote and feel like their vote is going to get counted accurately, but we need to make sure that the outcomes of these elections are actually representing the people. This year has been a tremendous year for Connecticut, and due in no large part to the efforts of the League. In terms of along all 4 of these pillars, kind of having reforms and enhancements in the way we run elections, and you're all familiar with those. So stepping back, today's elections use plurality voting. And so we're all familiar with this. We may not be as familiar with the name, but you go into you get your ballot or go into the voting booth and you mark your ballot for one candidate. And then it's pretty simple. The candidate with the most votes wins, even if that is less than a majority. But there are some kind of systemic weaknesses that plurality voting creates if we're thinking about this idea of representative outcomes. Our democratic elections are really about representing the will of the majority. And the problem with plurality voting is that it often fails to hit that goal, that target. And that harms both democracy and by doing so, people's trust in democracy. And we believe that there is a better way, and that is ranked choice voting. So what are some of these unintended consequences that plurality voting has? Well, first, voters will go into the booth and they often, and this really all pertains to when you have more than 2 candidates running. So when you have 2 candidates, there's a winner and there's a loser, and that's pretty simple. But we're talking about when we have 3 or more candidates running, very frequently the case in primaries, and certainly not unusually the case in general elections. So voters have this problem of struggling between choosing the candidate they like best or the one that has the best chance of winning against the one they like least. And our feeling is the voters shouldn't have to kind of figure out how to strategize. They should be able to go in and vote their preferences and without worrying about, if I vote for the person I really like, that's going to end up electing the person I really don't like. With early voting, and right now we don't have this problem in Connecticut. We very hopefully will soon have this problem, but I think something like a quarter of votes cast in some of the last general elections nationwide have been early, and certainly in primaries that's the case. And you have a problem that if you do vote early, you may end up voting for a candidate who by election day has dropped out, and then your vote's wasted and you really didn't have a say in the outcome. Third, it encourages win at all cost campaigning. And fourth, which is really the fundamental issue, is that candidates win with a majority of voters preferring other candidates. And that when you're thinking about representing the will of the majority, that doesn't quite jive. So this first problem of vote splitting, I think the 2016 election was a good example. Donald Trump won early Republican primaries, even though really twice as many Republican voters who were voting in those primaries preferred other candidates. And overall, over the course of the 50 primaries, that set him up to win the nomination without a majority of votes. And so what you have, what the underlying problem you have here is when you have a lot of candidates running, you can end up with a small faction within the party delivering victories to a candidate who is otherwise unpopular because the rest of the other votes were split among a whole lot of more like-minded candidates. And that happened in 2016. And certainly it's not just Republican primaries where that's happened. The second problem is the spoiler effect. And so in 1992, Ross Perot ran as an independent, and really for the first time, had an independent had a major influence on the outcome. So he got, close to 19% of the votes. And a lot of Republicans felt that he was responsible for Bush's defeat because he took votes away from Bush and therefore shifted electoral votes in multiple states from Bush to Clinton. And so, there was some feeling, and justifiably so, that had Ross Perot not been in that race, a majority of his votes would have gone to George Bush, and George Bush would have been the winner. And as it was, Bill Clinton won with 43% of the popular vote. So as you can see from these two examples, this is not a partisan thing. Plurality voting has sort of negative consequences, at least perceived by the voters of one party or another, on both sides. The third one, as I mentioned, was wasted votes. Good example of this was in the 2020 Democratic primary. Just a couple days before Super Tuesday, 3 of the candidates dropped out: Buttigieg, Klobuchar, and I forget the third. But 1.1 million primary voters had already cast early ballots for those 3 candidates. And so those 1 million voters didn't really have a say in, who was nominated for the Democratic, nominee in those primaries. And then the fourth problem is this win at all cost campaigning. And the unfortunate fact is we do pay more attention to negative information. It revs up our emotions and it scares us. And, that's why people use negative campaigning. It works. And with plurality voting, when as a candidate, you either get the vote or you don't, there's really no downside to tearing down your opponents. And so that's why people do it. It works. And, it is a good strategy, even if everybody always says they don't like negative campaigning. And we've had these problems right here in Connecticut in the 2000 gubernatorial election. In the Republican primary, Bob Stefanowski won the GOP primary with only 29% of the vote. So more than twice as many Republican voters preferred some other candidate. And then advancing to the general election, Oz Griebel got 55,000 votes in a contest that Stefanowski lost by only 44,000. And if you feel that Oz Griebel was taking more votes away from Stefanowski than Lamont, it's possible that he shifted the outcome of that race. And I certainly know that on the Democratic side, there was a lot of concern on that. And there were calls for Griebel to drop out, which really isn't fair. It's not fair to Oz Griebel, and it's not fair to the people that wanted to vote for him and wanted to be represented by him. So what this boils down to is that preferences aren't all or nothing. but the way we vote actually sort of acts as though they are. So it's human nature that when we're presented with choices, we have degrees of preference. So if I go into Baskin Robbins and say, I'd like a coffee ice cream, and they say, sorry, Jonathan, we don't have any coffee ice cream, I'm not going to say, well, give me any one of those other 30 flavors. I don't really care. Of course not. I'm going to say, well, you don't have coffee, I'd like to have chocolate, or if you don't have chocolate, I'll take vanilla. So when your first choice isn't available, you have a backup choice when you're presented with a series of choices. And so our sort of rhetorical question is, shouldn't that be reflected in our voting system? And the answer is yes, we believe it should. And there's a way to do that, which is ranked choice voting. So instead of picking just one candidate, ranked choice voting lets you rank multiple candidates in the order you prefer them. And this little video sort of explains how it works.
So what is ranked choice voting? In most parts of the United States, voters select a single candidate for each position on their ballot, and the candidate with the most votes wins. This is known as single choice winner-take-all, which can sometimes result in the election of a candidate who earned only a small percentage of the vote, even when the majority of voters supported other candidates. But that's not the only way of electing our leaders. Ranked choice voting is another voting method which allows voters to rank their candidates in order of preference. In a ranked choice voting election, a candidate needs to earn more than half of the votes to win. All first choices are counted, and if a candidate has a majority, then they win, just like any other election. If not, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and voters who picked that candidate as number one will have their votes count for their next choice. This process continues until a candidate earns a majority and is declared the winner. Let's look at an example. Here, you select orange as your first choice candidate, yellow as your second, pink as your third, and green as your final choice. The first choices are counted. Yellow earned 35%, orange 21%, pink earned 28%, and green earned 16% of the vote. Because nobody won more than 50%, the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and voters who picked him as their first choice have their ballots count for their second choice. This continues until a candidate receives more than half of the votes, or 50% plus 1.
So just to recap the key elements of ranked choice voting, voters have the option to rank candidates according to preference, but it is an option. You're not forced to rank all the candidates, and your ballot wouldn't be invalidated if you only wanted to pick your top choice. And then the first choice votes are counted, and if no candidate gets a majority of votes on the counting of the first choices, an instant runoff takes place. And the way that happens is the last place candidate is eliminated, and then the second choices for the voters who voted for that eliminated candidate are then redistributed to the remaining candidates. And that process continues until candidates receive more than 50%, until one candidate receives a majority of votes. So ranked choice voting, we believe, strengthens our democracy, and it does so by producing more representative outcomes, because the people who are elected will have the support of the majority. And when we say the majority, that doesn't necessarily mean that for all voters it was their first choice, but at least it was their second choice. And in most cases, it won't be their last choice. And so the idea is there's a consensus around who the elected candidate is. It eliminates the unintended consequences that we talked about from plurality voting. So there's no such thing as a spoiler candidate, because you go in, you vote for Oz Griebel because that's who you really want to see elected. But if nobody gets a majority and he's the lowest vote getter, then he drops out, and your vote for Bob Stefanowski would have counted, or your vote for Ned Lamont would have counted. So you don't have to worry about your least favorite candidate being elected because you voted for your favorite candidate. You also have the eliminate the issue of vote splitting, because going back to the Republican 2016 primary, in many of the the state primaries, certainly until candidates started dropping out, nobody got a majority on the first round. And you would expect that among the 10 or 11 people running, as candidates who dropped out, the people who picked anyone other than Donald Trump, their second choice or third choice or fourth choice probably wouldn't have been Donald Trump. And so it's certainly much more likely that one of those 10, call them mainstream, so to speak, candidates would have ended up being the nominee. And then lastly, there's no more wasted votes, because if a candidate drops out by election day, then, and that's the person you voted for first, then your second choice will come into play. So, and then let's talk about the benefits of ranked choice voting. So not only does it get rid of problems, but it actually brings new value to how we run elections. It promotes more diverse candidates and viewpoints, because more candidates are encouraged to run. There's a lot of sort of kind of self-elimination, because people don't want to run as spoilers, and they don't want to worry about electing somebody that they don't have more alignment with than less. So this brings more candidates into races, and that gives voters more choice, and thus the reason we call ourselves Voter Choice Connecticut. It reduces negative campaigning. If there are 3 candidates, and let's say you're not the first choice of a voter, you might go to that voter and say, well, I know you're not my first, that I'm not your first choice, but let me tell you how I'm similar to the person who is your first choice. We do share some things, so I'd encourage you to vote for me as your second choice. And so rather than looking at trashing their opponents, they actually are going to look for common ground. It frees voters to express their true preferences without having to worry about strategizing how to vote. It ensures the winner has the broadest support of the electorate. And that in turn increases confidence in our democracy, or trust in our democracy and our elections. There's been some concern expressed by some people and candidates of color, or people who are observing this, that ranked choice voting is not good for minority candidates. And it's a little hard to get to why there is that feeling or concern. But in some cases, very clearly, it's been said that voters of color will not understand how to vote, and that will drive lower turnout. I believe, and we believe, that is a fairly racist approach or assessment of candidates or voters of color being able to figure out how to vote. And I'll show you some statistics later that suggest that it's not accurate. But there have been lots of studies across the various municipalities, mostly it's municipalities that have been using ranked choice voting, that demonstrate just the opposite. It encourages more candidates to run, and it actually is electing more candidates of color and more women candidates. The New York City recent election was a good example of this. They elected their second Black mayor ever. And they ended up with a city council that is more racially and ethnically diverse than ever before, and twice as many women as before. But this is something that we definitely need to address, because it has been raised as an issue here in Connecticut, a concern. Ranked choice voting is being recognized for its reform potential. Last year, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences came out with this really very kind of groundbreaking report about how to reinvent democracy for the 21st century. And there were 6 strategies and I don't know, 20 or so recommendations. The first strategy was, what can we do to achieve equality of voice and representation? And ranked choice voting was one of the recommendations. And it's been mentioned in a variety of other instances as a way to better improve our representative democracy, such as the book that I mentioned to you at the beginning by Lawrence Lessig also talks about ranked choice voting. It's currently used in 25 states across the country. This actually hasn't been updated for the 2020 or for the 2021 election. There were some more municipalities adopted it. Alaska now uses it for statewide elections. But the fact is, it is in use in quite a few places, and in both red and blue states. In 2021, ranked choice voting bills of one sort or another were introduced in 29 different states, including here in Connecticut, which again sort of attests to its popularity as an election reform that's getting a lot of traction. looking at the use of ranked choice voting in New York City. And interestingly, it was used in the primaries only, not in the general election. And mainly because in New York City, it's really the Democratic primary that generally determines who is going to win the general election. And so it in particular was used there, and it addresses the problem of vote splitting and spoiler candidate, so-called spoiler candidates. So the exit polls showed that 3/4 of voters wanted to use ranked choice voting again. 83%, so 4 out of 5 voters ranked more than one candidate, and virtually everyone said that the ballot was simple to complete. And this is very important because it gets back to this concern, and frankly, it's a concern that's been raised by legislators on both sides of the aisle, that it's just too complicated. Voters won't get it. Now, it is true, it is a different way of voting, and it will require voter education, but we shouldn't let the need to educate voters on an election system keep us from doing something that is actually going to generate better, more representative outcomes. And as a side note, there was a lot of controversy during the tallying of votes for the primary in New York City, and those were not issues with ranked choice voting. They were issues with the elections board, which is essentially incompetent. And the interesting thing to note is it's likely that no candidate would have gotten more than 40%, which would have forced a runoff. And that runoff would have not happened at least for 4 weeks or so after the primary. So in fact, by using ranked choice voting, they got election results much, much sooner than they would have otherwise. And so there was some kind of narrative about, oh, this is taking too long, but in fact, they knew who the winner was weeks before they would have had they used plurality voting. And just yesterday, in the House, there was an amendment to the Protecting Our Democracy Act, which did pass in the House, and that amendment called for $40 million in grants to states and cities who need help or want help implementing ranked choice voting. And so this is, it obviously stands a very difficult time to get this passed in the Senate. But the idea that our Congress is actually now starting to recognize the value of ranked choice voting is an important step in kind of our overall campaign of recognizing the benefits of ranked choice voting. And it does address one of the concerns that's been raised in Connecticut is, how much is this going to cost if we implement it? So we believe it is time to bring ranked choice voting to Connecticut. And that is what our citizen-led all-volunteer group has been working on since the end of 2018. We kind of came together, we modeled it after the campaign that a lot of us were also involved in getting the National Popular Vote Compact adopted by Connecticut, which is to say when you get lots of grassroots advocates and citizens who care to speak up, you can actually achieve a lot. You can get bills passed. So we do have quite a large engaged supporter base. A lot of them are members of league chapters. And we have a lot of strong relationships with state and national voter advocacy groups, and the league is probably at the top of that list. They've been very helpful, or you have been very helpful ever since the beginning in terms of testifying in support of the bill and amplifying our calls to action. So we really value that support. Our first goal is to pass what we're calling the RCV Study Bill. And we're simply asking the legislature to set up a task force to study the implementation of ranked choice voting. And there's a couple of reasons that we chose this strategy as opposed to just saying, let's adopt ranked choice voting. One, there are, definitely sort of logistical things that need to be considered in terms of, how elections get tallied and so on and so forth that need to be studied and understood before we jump in. We also felt, it is a significant change to how we vote. And so we thought, we really do need time and the opportunity, particularly to bring the legislators up to speed on why we think this is an important election reform. And it's also sort of allowed us to kind of capitalize on the growing national momentum. So we think this is the right strategy to, kind of start with, let's figure out all the details and answer questions that people have before sort of saying, hey, we should just do this. That said, we don't think passing the study bill really should be all that difficult. It was introduced first in 2019, so it was raised in the Government Administration and Elections Committee. Got a public hearing, was voted out of that committee. It passed the House by a vote of 75 to 70, although there were a few legislators that cast their vote against it when they meant to vote for it, so the margin was actually a bit higher. It did not get called in the Senate. At that time, we really didn't have a champion in the Senate. And for those of you familiar with the the process of getting bills passed, there's always this log jam at the end of the session, and we just didn't really have somebody who was looking out for us to get the bill called in the Senate. We do believe had it been called, it would have passed. The bill was raised again in 2020 through a lot of support from grassroots advocates, getting in touch with the GAE chairs and asking them to raise the bill. That was the second year of the legislative session, so it's a committee bill, can't be introduced by legislators. Then the pandemic came along, and so everything came to a halt, so we didn't make any progress in 2020. And then this year it was again introduced, and it was actually introduced by 10 legislators, co-introduced the bill, which is actually notable. If you look at most bills, that is not the case. And it attracted 28 co-sponsors. We went in understanding that there was a very crowded agenda for GAE and some very important and importantly time bills that really had to be dealt with this year, like the ballot resolutions and the ending prison gerrymandering. So we understood that the bill didn't ultimately get raised by GAE. But we nonetheless, the members of that committee heard from hundreds of our supporters, and we were definitely on their radar. And our feeling is the point about it not being a heavy lift is there's no fiscal note attached to this bill. It does have strong grassroots support. It's been endorsed by the Connecticut Secretary of the State, the Connecticut League of Women Voters. And when I say endorsed, the study bill has been endorsed by the League, not necessarily ranked choice voting itself. But that's kind of why we want the study bill, is so that people can further understand the value. Common Cause has also supported it. So our kind of going forward into 2022, we think the outlook is much better. The agenda for GAE is really much more open. It's not crowded with all the things that were on there this year. We are continuing to build grassroots support, which is exactly why we're here before the League today, strengthening our allies in the General Assembly. And we do have quite a few allies in the legislature, including quite a few of the members of GAE. So we're continuing to recruit volunteers and build our in-state coalitions. And with that, I will stop and very happy to take any questions that people have. And I would encourage you, I'm just pointing you to the chat, if you'd like to kind of keep up with what we're doing and kind of join our efforts, please subscribe to our emails. We don't send out that many. And again, our success really is contingent on having citizens and voters who, advocate on behalf of this. Okay, I see there is, let me see if I can see that. So I see a couple questions here. Henry had a good question, his first question, which then I'll get to his others. His question was about, should we do this at the municipal level and kind of have that like be a pilot? And we've had a lot of conversations about that at Ranked Choice Vote, at Voter Choice Connecticut. And our feeling, the reason that we have focused on statewide elections is there hasn't been any kind of grassroots interest in one city or another to adopt ranked choice voting. If there was, we would certainly be supportive, but as kind of a small grassroots organization, we don't have that many resources, and we felt we could get the most impact by focusing at the state level. That said, if there were some city or town that was interested in doing it, we certainly would support the effort. RCV resources has a helpful assessment of ballot design. Henry has referred to the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, and they have lots of really good information, particularly about implementation. And his question is, what is what are our thoughts about addressing some of the things that they've talked about. For one, that report has come out relatively recently, so we haven't dived into the details of it. But we do need to, and try to have as best we can answers to the things that they raise. But that again kind of goes back to why we want this study bill, so that we can actually study some of these more detailed questions and come up with more thoughtful answers for them. What we can say is the other municipalities around the country that are using ranked choice voting have not run into problems in terms of figuring out how to design their ballot. It is simpler at a municipal level because it's just smaller. But Maine has been using it for a few cycles now, and they've been able to do so okay. Do you know what the party line vote was in the House on the voting bill? I don't know, Tricia, maybe you have the answer to that. I'm going to guess, well, I certainly know it was a party line vote. Whether there was any Republicans who voted for the bill yesterday, I can't say, I'm not sure. And let's see, Karen, do you know if our tabulators can be programmed to count ranked choice ballots? My understanding is the current equipment is capable of handling ranked choice voting, but I'm not positive about that, and we can try to get an answer for that question. And I'm looking at Henry's third question. Laura, you're on mute.
Actually, I can answer that question. The tabulators that we currently have are not able to be programmed for that. However, we are looking at new tabulators in the next few years, since ours are over 20 years old. So hopefully by then we'll have all of this ready to go. That's the hope.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, which is why we need to be thoughtful about this. Other than all the other benefits we might have had by new tabulators, I'm thankful that we didn't just buy new tabulators that weren't able to do this. So Henry also asked, has ranked choice voting been adopted by other jurisdictions in the narrow scope of overseas military absentee ballots? Good question. So what Henry's referring to is in overseas and military ballots, absentee ballots, you kind of got this problem that they're casting their votes, I guess in some cases months before the actual election day. And so they are confronted by this problem that some candidates may drop out by the time election day rolls around. And in fact, I don't have the exact numbers, but I do know in that map that we showed, there are a number of states that use ranked choice voting for overseas and military absentee ballots for exactly that reason. I don't know, I'm not aware in the past couple of years anyway, of any effort in Connecticut to do that. And I can't say whether that happened before or not. Any questions about just sort of how local leagues, might get involved with this effort? I will say that we are more than willing and would be thrilled to do a presentation or conversation like this to any local league. We also have kind of like the 20-minute version, so you can go through fewer slides, and so that it can be part of one of your regularly scheduled meetings. And John can drop in our email addresses in case you are interested in scheduling a meeting. And John Warburg, who is helping me out here, has been like our master outreach person in terms of lining up conversations like the one that we're having today. Pam asks, can you parse the difference between RCV versus the ill-named jungle primaries in some states, which I've heard come into practice as a way of impeding Black candidates from likelihood of success? I have to say I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to. So maybe if Pam wants to just, if we want to invite her up, or if somebody else on the panel can reiterate or sort of reinterpret that. Hi, Pam.
Hi, I thank you so much for doing this. I am very interested to follow up on the comment that you made that there have been comments and concerns made about ranked choice voting in terms of what they do for minority candidates.
Mhm.
And when I've tried to engage in conversations with minorities about that concern, I have heard some say that there are elements of the ranked choice process that replicates the primary structure that some states in the South have, where the primaries are open. They're not limited by party, but
Right.
everybody votes for their candidates at the same time, irrespective of parties. And like as happened most recently in Georgia, and visibly in Georgia.
Mhm.
And then that eliminates all of the candidates except two.
Mhm.
So, and then there's a second runoff election.
Right.
But that at least some people have explained that seemingly to us sort of inefficient primary process that forces two elections in so many cases.
Yeah.
It came into being because of a sort of structural calculation that it would be very hard for minority candidates to win under that structure.
Yeah.
It's not the same as ranked choice, but it has some of the same elements that if you don't
Right.
get to that 50% threshold, there's another round.
Right.
And so I wonder whether there's either any study or any or any sort of theoretical thought about why ranked choice is different in that incentive structure than the jungle primary structure.
Yeah. So I guess there's a few things. First is the actual what's been happening where it has been used. And in most cases, well, I shouldn't say most cases, but certainly in studies that have been done of municipalities that are using ranked choice voting, they are seeing more candidates of color running and winning. So the sort of evidence doesn't suggest some kind of underlying structural disadvantage. And then from sort of a conceptual or theoretical perspective, there isn't really a reason why it should disadvantage minority candidates. Some of the concerns have been actually the opposite, which is if you have, well, let me see. So this does sort of get to voting, kind of tribalism voting. And so if people are voting that way, is that good or bad in a ranked choice voting election versus a plurality voting? And I would say it's probably better because you still have this, even if my candidate doesn't win, I still have an influence on what the ultimate outcome is. And also, let's say it's a primary and you have a number of candidates running, and let's say you have two candidates of color running against maybe one white candidate. And so if people are sort of voting tribally, the votes are going to be split among the candidates of color, and they are going to therefore be much more likely to lose. Whereas in a ranked choice voting election, they could vote for their first choice candidate of color and their second choice candidate of color, and that would not disadvantage, whoever was the lowest, who got the fewest votes would drop out. And let's, for argument's sake, say that is one of the candidates of color. Well, then those votes would then go, again, if people are strictly voting that way, and I'm not saying people do, but that's sort of the context that it's being presented in, then the people who voted for the candidate of color who dropped out, their votes will now go to the candidate of color who remains, making it more likely that that candidate actually will win. So I don't see structurally, why it should disadvantage minority candidates. I know there was, I think, in the New York City primaries, when they adopted ranked choice voting for the primaries, they also adopted it for special elections. And I know there was a move in the beginning of, I guess it was the beginning of this year, there were some lawsuits to prohibit it from being used in some special elections. They were brought by, I believe, Black candidates, and those suits were dismissed. And from what I understand, it seemed like a lot of the motivation was more about incumbents preserving their power than whether it really was good or bad for Black or brown voters. And it's interesting, in Washington, D.C., they are considering using ranked choice voting, I believe, for like their city council, something like that. And there have been sort of similar, no, not similar, actually, the other thing that I talked about, which is voters of color won't get it. And some candidates have come out in DC, some Black candidates come out and say that is incredibly racist thing to say. You know, who says a Black candidate, a Black voter doesn't understand how to vote a ballot any more so than a white voter does. And I have to say, I would tend to agree with that assessment. We need education. People need to be aware of, you know, how it works. New York City, with I guess it was probably, I'm not sure where the league was involved in the New York City election, in the educational effort, but there was a huge educational effort, and it appears to have been pretty successful. So Pam, I hope that answered the question. Well, we're actually kind of working on putting together some like fact sheets about this, because it probably is the, you know, I mean, it's a reasonable concern and it deserves an answer. And so we're trying to kind of collect more information on that. And there have been a few kind of like white papers and articles written on this, and we can circulate those. And we're kind of trying to put together our own kind of like one-page fact sheet.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another question was, how long will it take for results to come in after elections or polls close? And so it is true that it can potentially take longer, because you have this, you know, need to potentially have, you know, multiple rounds. It's kind of instant runoff. And if you're, for example, talking about a statewide election, and in Connecticut, you know, it's a little bit more complicated that we have, you know, towns and cities running elections as opposed to counties. So there are more, you know, places where ballots are counted. So it may very possibly take longer. But remember, this only happens when there's more than 2 candidates running, and outside of primaries, that, you know, that does happen, but it doesn't happen all the time. And I think from our last election, we're starting to educate voters that you shouldn't necessarily expect election results the night of the election. And I think we will say, and, you know, again, it's about managing expectations, but if that's the cost of having an election system that produces better election outcomes, I think that's a price that we think is worth paying. It's not even a price, just a, you know, a factor. So Deirdre, thank you for your question. What are the main objections to ranked choice voting, and do any of them have merit? So I'd say the main objection that we've heard, one sec, is that it's too confusing, voters won't get it. And that gets mentioned often. And I think, as you saw in the New York City exit poll results, where 95% of the voters said they get it, in study after study done in municipalities, similar outcomes, we're seeing similar kind of responses, that people understand. A large number of voters are actually voting, or, you know, ranking more than one candidate, which suggests that they get it. And a majority of voters actually, you know, when they're specifically asked, would you like to continue using ranked choice voting, they say yes. So, and I think part of it is trying to explain how it works, and like how the tabulation works is a lot more complicated than giving somebody a ballot and saying, pick your first, second, and third choice. It's actually not that hard. So that's one you know, complaint that we hear a lot, or concern that we hear a lot. The second one really is about this concern about how it impacts candidates of color. And again, I think that the evidence and sort of the theoretical assessment suggests that really should not be a concern. And beyond that, in the public hearings, we heard some concerns thrown out that I really don't think have merit. I'd say those other 2 questions are completely reasonable questions, and I think they don't have merit in the sense that I don't think they actually are concerns, but they're good questions and reasonable ones. Some other concerns were thrown out. One of the legislators on the GAE committee said, well, if you vote for the candidate who got the fewest votes and nobody got a majority and that candidate has been eliminated, then, and you only picked one candidate, you've been disenfranchised. And I have to say that's just an absurd assessment. The voter was given the opportunity to rank multiple candidates and chose not to, so that was their choice. And in plurality voting, that's sort of like saying, well, I voted for the person and they lost, so I got disenfranchised. That's just not how elections work. The other concern that was raised by another legislator on GAE was, well, if you can win by getting second choice votes, candidates really aren't going to try that hard to get first choice votes. They're just going to, kind of make a mediocre effort and hope they get elected on second choice votes. I happen to think that's also absurd. I think candidates go in it to win, and by being picked as first choices, and I don't think anybody's going to not try just as hard because the fact that they may benefit from being somebody's second choice. So those are the four or so that have come to us, and cost has been raised, just the cost of implementation. Again, I don't have an answer for that, and that's why there needs to be a study bill or a study. There certainly will be some costs, both I think in education as well as potentially, just looking at new processes and how things get tabulated. And again, our feeling is, if it drives better election outcomes, then when I say by better, I mean giving voters more choice and having the outcome be more representative, then I think that's a cost worth bearing. And the House of Representatives appears to agree with us, and they just allocated $40 million to support implementation. And I'm trying to think if there's any other, those are really the main ones. And so, there isn't, so another question or another concern is, this is a partisan thing. This is about Democrats trying to take control. And that's one of the reasons that I gave you a variety of examples of how this produces outcomes that have not been good for that plurality voting produces outcomes that haven't been good for Republicans in some cases and haven't been good for Democrats in some cases. And I will say, to Pam's point about elections in Georgia, I think it's safe to say that with ranked choice voting, there would not have been runoff, or there wouldn't have been the need for runoff elections in the Senate races. And my understanding is that there were more than, there were two conservative candidates in those races. And so if vote splitting occurred there, it was in the plurality election, it was to the disadvantage of the Republican Senate candidates. And in a ranked choice voting election, the control of the Senate would have been in Republican hands. So, I like to say it doesn't advantage Democrats, it doesn't advantage Republicans, it advantages voters.
I think there's one more in the chat, Jonathan.
How do interest groups in Connecticut respond? Registrars, town clerks. Excellent question. We have some work to do in terms of, kind of sitting down with town clerks and registrars and kind of getting, it's probably more town clerks in terms of running elections, getting them comfortable. And I have to say, we are not experts in the implementation of ranked choice voting, partly just because as a small all volunteer group, we have limited resources. And right now we're trying to focus on getting this bill passed. And so, we don't have a deep bench of people who are kind of studying some of the implementation questions. But we very much need to have those discussions, want to get them on board, because we understand, particularly in Connecticut, change is difficult. So in terms of interest groups, in the sort of large coalition that many of you are members of, the sort of informal coalition that was put together last year to advance no excuse absentee voting during the pandemic, a lot of the organizations were supportive of ranked choice voting. We had a sign-on op-ed in the beginning of the year last year that some 20 or 30 organizations signed, including the League and Common Cause and the Connecticut League of Conservation Voters and a lot of the the activist groups. So there has been broad support from other kind of democracy reform organizations in Connecticut. Thank you, Henry. We'll definitely have a follow-up with you, because there's plenty of learning we have to do in this Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center and the RCV maps that I think it was Henry referred to. There's a ton of like valuable information there, and I do want to study that. So it's almost the top of the hour, and just thank you so much for your time and interest, and thanks to the League for hosting us. And if anybody is interested in doing kind of similar either long or short sessions in your local leagues, we are thrilled to have that opportunity to talk to people, and if you have questions, reach out to us. And with that, I will turn it back over to Laura and her cat.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for all the great questions. It's one of those ways that we can expand voter power, right? It's really about the people and getting them to participate more and keep them engaged. So I really look forward to trying to get this together for our state. We certainly can use more choices, not less.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much. And this is a cat. It's a Zoom call. Had to be a cat somewhere. It's mine. Today is mine. I'm not even going to try to move her because I will get attacked. She'll attack.
We don't want that to happen.
I don't want that to happen. However you celebrate the holidays, I hope everybody has a great holiday season. I don't know what you're doing, but I hope it's safe. I hope it's peaceful, and have a great time. We all can use a little cheer this time around. And if you have any questions about the League, please don't hesitate to visit our website, reach out to us. We're always available to talk to people about what we do and what we can do for voters. Thank you very much, everybody.